Frank kissed me goodbye every morning, just like he always had. Shirt pressed, coffee mug in hand, leather briefcase swinging by his side as he walked out the door at exactly 7:45. It was so familiar, so ordinary, that I didn't notice how much of it was a performance until it wasn't. At first, it was little things. The sound of his car returning barely 15 minutes after he left. The way his suit smelled less like the office and more like the pine trees near the old park, how his shoes sat untouched at the door all day, yet came home scuffed in the evening. Then came the bills. An envelope from the power company with a red stamp, a credit card payment missed for the first time in 15 years. Frank brushed it off, said he'd call the bank, but his voice was too light, too rehearsed. I didn't ask. I wanted to, but something in his eyes told me not to. There was a kind of quiet panic in him. I knew that look. It was the same look he had the day he held our newborn daughter for the first time. I've been a housewife for over 30 years. I know how to read a room, a pause, a breath. And that week, everything in our house felt like it was holding its breath. One afternoon, I forgot the eggs at the grocery store and decided to walk back. I passed the community park, and that's when I saw him. Frank, sitting alone on a bench, in his suit. Just sitting. No phone, no laptop, no meeting. Just a man in a nice jacket staring at nothing. I ducked behind the fence, heart pounding like I'd seen a stranger in my husband's skin. Why didn't he tell me? Why was he pretending? That night, he came home like nothing happened. Told me traffic had been terrible. Meetings went long. Apologized for being too tired to eat dinner. And I played along. Because I knew. I knew whatever storm he was trying to hold back. It wasn't just about money. It was about shame. The next morning, he left again, same time, same words. But this time, I followed him. I stayed back far enough not to be seen. He drove toward downtown, but turned 2 blocks before his old building, parked near a strip of quiet offices, and just sat in the car for hours. When he finally drove away, I stood there, heart cracked but steady. That night, I stood at the kitchen counter, staring at a bag of flour and a stick of butter, remembering my mother's apple pie recipe. I hadn't baked it in years, not since Emma left for college. I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew I had to do something. Something to keep us afloat. Something to keep him from drowning. I tied on my apron and whispered to myself, "We're not going to break. Not like this." And so, I opened the oven, not just to bake a pie, but to start saving the man I loved, without ever letting him know he needed saving. The smell of cinnamon and sugar wrapped around the kitchen like a blanket. It had been years since I'd baked anything more than a quick banana bread for the church potluck. But that night, I poured myself into it. I didn't follow the recipe exactly. Somewhere along the way, it became instinct. My hands knew what to do, even if my heart still didn't. By the time Frank came home, the pie was cooling on the windowsill, and the kitchen was spotless. He raised an eyebrow. Apple pie? I smiled, thought I'd make something sweet. He nodded, said nothing. He didn't eat any. Just went to bed early and closed the door a little harder than necessary. I sat alone at the table, slicing myself a small piece, and as I took the first bite, I remembered something from years ago. The first time Frank ever tried my pie, he said, "You could sell this, you know." I laughed then. It felt like a compliment wrapped in a joke. But now, it felt like a whisper from a different life. The next morning, while Frank left for his job, I boxed up the rest of the pie and brought it across the street to Martha, our neighbor. I told her I had extras. She took one bite, closed her eyes, and said, "Helen, this is heavenly." I smiled politely. I didn't tell her why I'd really made it. Later that afternoon, I got a call. "Do you have any more? My niece is visiting this weekend. I'd love to order a full one." Order. The word caught me off guard. "Oh," I said, "I wasn't really planning to sell it." "Well, you should," she replied. "I posted a photo online and people are already asking where I got it." That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and stared at my phone. I had no website, no business, no plan. But I did have a kitchen, and I did have a kitchen, and I did have a kitchen, and I did have a way forward. I created a small Instagram account and called it Ovenbeheart. I uploaded a picture of the pie from Martha's post, wrote a caption, "Small batch homemade comfort, DM to order." I didn't tell Frank. The next day, I had 3 messages. 2 from people I didn't know. One from a woman who lived 5 blocks away. She wanted 2 pies by Sunday, said she'd pay in cash. My hands shook as I typed. Yes, absolutely. I went to the store that afternoon with the last of my rainy day money. I'd tucked away in the cookie jar. Bought fresh apples, flour, butter. I came home, tied on my apron again, and went to work. And just like that, I wasn't afraid anymore. Each pie I baked felt like stitching something back together, one crust, one filling, one careful slice at a time. The kitchen, once a place of routine, became my little world of quiet determination. Frank still didn't know. He would come home tired and distracted, muttering vague things about another long meeting and maybe a promotion soon. His lies were soft now, almost tender. I didn't blame him. He was trying to protect me in the only way he knew how. But he didn't know I was already protecting him. By the end of the first week, I had 9 orders. I started waking up earlier, baking before sunrise, making sure everything was cleaned and cooled before Frank returned. I hid my ingredients behind old containers in the pantry. I labeled my flour jars as rice and tucked baking trays behind the holiday decorations. It was like running a secret operation in plain sight, and somehow I loved it. I didn't feel like a helpless wife waiting for the next bad news. I felt like someone who still had power. That weekend, Lily came to visit. She spotted a pie cooling on the rack and raised an eyebrow. I froze for a second, then smiled, just playing around. She leaned against the counter. "You never just play around." I hesitated. "Don't tell your father." But just small stuff. She blinked. "Wait, seriously?" I nodded. Don't say anything yet. He's going through something. Lily didn't push. She just looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time in a long while. Mom, she said softly, this is kind of badass. I laughed for the first time in days. And just like that, I had my first co-conspirator. By Sunday night, as the last pie left our porch in the hands of a smiling customer, I stood in the kitchen and realized something. Maybe I wasn't just saving us from sinking. Maybe I was rising, quietly, steadily, into someone I hadn't been in years. And I wasn't done yet. By the second week, my small baking side project had turned into something. Orders were doubling. People were requesting custom pies, gluten-free crusts, even asking if I offered delivery. I'd get messages at all hours. Are you the pie lady? Or do you have anything left today? I'll take whatever you've got. It was exciting. It was terrifying. I had never run a business. I didn't even know how to track expenses properly, though I had started keeping receipts in an old tin under the sink. My hands ached from rolling dough, and my back stiffened from hours at the oven. But I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Needed. Not just as a wife or mother, but as me. As Helen. Lily came over again and helped me design a better logo for my Instagram page. This looks legit now, she said, showing me the screen. I shook my head, laughing. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But even as I said it, I started wondering. Meanwhile, Frank had grown more distant. He still left the house every morning, still wore his work clothes, but now there was a dullness in his eyes I couldn't ignore. When I asked about his day, he gave word answers. When I offered to cook dinner together like we used to, he brushed me off. I'm tired, he'd say. It was a long day. But we both knew he wasn't coming from the office. We just didn't have the courage to admit it out loud. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. and found the light on in the living room. I tiptoed down the hall and saw Frank sitting on the couch, staring at his phone in the dark. I stood quietly for a moment, watching him from the doorway. His face was tired, not just physically, but spiritually tired. Like he was losing parts of himself, one piece at a time. And still, I said nothing. Because I knew if I pushed too hard, the fragile thread holding us together might snap. The next day, I received a message from someone named Valerie Chen. She introduced herself as a food blogger and small business advocate. She had tried one of my pies at Martha's book club and wanted to feature Oven by Heart on her weekly spotlight. At first, I panicked. I wasn't ready for attention. But Lily urged me to say yes. You've got something, Mom. I agreed to the interview, with conditions. No last name. The feature went live 3 days later. And that's when everything changed. My inbox exploded. Dozens of new orders. Messages from local cafes asking if I offered wholesale. Even a church fundraiser wanted to place a bulk order for their spring event. I was thrilled, overwhelmed. And then I made a mistake. I forgot to delete the open tab on our shared laptop. That evening, Frank sat down to check his email and froze. I was cooking dinner when I heard his voice from the living room. "Helen, what's oven by heart?" My heart dropped. I dried my hands, walked slowly into the room. "You've been selling pies?" I nodded slowly. "I was going to tell you." "Why didn't you?" His voice wasn't angry. It was hurt, confused, like a man who just realized the world kept spinning while he stood still. I walked closer, choosing every word with care. "Because I knew you were going through something, and I didn't want to make it worse by showing you I had to step in." He looked down. "So you did step in?" I hesitated. "Yes, but not because I thought you were weak. Because I love you, and I didn't want us to fall apart waiting for a miracle." Frank sat back, rubbing his temples. "I've been pretending for so long, I don't even know who I am anymore." I knelt beside him, took his hand. "You're still my husband. You're still the man who made me laugh when we had no money, who stayed up all night with a crying baby, who never let me feel alone. That man's still in there. He's just—" He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in weeks. And then, in a quiet voice, he said, "I don't want to pretend anymore." I exhaled, tears burning the corners of my eyes. "Then let's stop." That night, we sat together at the kitchen table, just the two of us. I showed him the orders, the notes from customers, the photos Lily had taken of the pies. He smiled, slowly, hesitantly, but genuinely. "You did all this?" he asked. "I did," I said, "but not alone." He nodded, voice soft. "Then maybe I can help now." And just like that, the walls began to fall. The next morning, Frank woke up before me. I heard the soft clatter of pans in the kitchen, the smell of coffee stronger than usual. When I walked in, he was wearing an old apron I hadn't seen since our first Thanksgiving in this house. It was too tight around the waist now, stained from decades ago, but he wore it like armor. "I tried to preheat the oven," he said, sheepish. "No idea if I did it right." I smiled. "That's a start." He looked around at the baking supplies I had carefully hidden in plain sight. The flour jars, the stacked tins, the spice rack I'd rearranged like puzzle pieces to fit everything. "I can't believe I didn't notice," he said, shaking his head. "I didn't want you to." He nodded slowly. "I get that now." We spent the morning baking 2 pies together. He was clumsy, overfloured everything, and kept forgetting which drawer held the measuring cups. But he didn't give up. When I asked why he was suddenly so determined, he just said, "Because I want to be useful again." It wasn't just about the pies. It was about presents. Later that week, we delivered our largest order yet, 15 pies for a small catering event. Frank insisted on carrying the boxes, adjusting the labels, even chatting with the woman who placed the order. "She's the real talent," he said, pointing to me. But I saw something shift in him as we walked back to the car. His shoulders were straighter, his steps lighter. The next day, I found him at the dining table, sketching rough notes on paper napkins. "What's that?" I asked. "Just ideas," he said. "What if we made a few savory pies? chicken pot pie, spinach and feta. I stared at him. What? He said. I used to watch Food Network too, you know. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. It was like watching spring return. After a long silent winter, the man who once disappeared behind a mask of shame was now resurfacing, one silly pie joke at a time. And our kitchen, once just a quiet space to prepare meals, had become a studio of renewal. We reorganized the pantry together. He made shelves for baking trays. Lily helped us build a simple website. We even printed little cards with our logo and slipped them into every order, with the words, "Baked by heart," "From our family to yours." Customers started tagging us in photos. Families eating our pies at dinner. Elderly couples saying it reminded them of home. A local reporter reached out, asking if we'd be interested in a feature for the Sunday paper. Frank looked at me nervously. You ready for that kind of attention? I smiled. We've already lived through the hard part. What's a little spotlight? The article ran 2 weeks later with the headline, "A Kitchen, a Secret, and the Pies That Saved a Marriage." They didn't exaggerate. That same afternoon, Frank got a call from his old company. Not an offer to return, but an invitation to speak at a workshop about transitioning after retirement. Me? He asked, stunned. Why would they want me? Because, I said, taking his hand, you found your way out, and not many people know how. He didn't say yes right away, but he didn't say no either. That night, after closing out our orders, we stood on the porch, watching the neighborhood settle into dusk. The soft glow of windows, the quiet of evening. Frank slid an arm around my shoulder. You know, he said, I used to think falling meant failing. I looked up at him. And now? Now I know. Falling is just the part before you learn how to stand again. I rested my head against his chest. I'm proud of you. He kissed the top of my head. I'm proud of us. And there we were, 2 people in their 60s learning how to dream again. Flower stained, a little wrinkled, but stronger than ever. Not because we never broke, but because we figured out how to rebuild together. The morning of our first official farmers' market, I woke up to the sound of Frank humming in the kitchen. He'd been up since 5. The pies were already cooling on the rack, and a small army of boxes stood neatly stacked near the door, each labeled with our new logo and a handwritten note inside, "Made with Love," by Helen Frank. It had taken months to get here, from hiding pie tins in the back of the pantry to standing side by side behind a table at the community market, offering slices to strangers and smiling like kids at a bake sale. I slipped on my apron and walked in. He turned around, holding a steaming mug of coffee for me, extra cinnamon, just how I liked it. Ready for our debut? He asked, with that grin I hadn't seen in years. I nodded. Let's show them what 60 can do. We set up our booth under a small white canopy wedged between a honey vendor and a woman selling crocheted potholders. The first few minutes were quiet. Then came a couple asking, "Are you the ones from the newspaper?" Then a teenage girl who said her grandma made her come. But okay, wow, This is actually really good." Within an hour, we were sold out. People lingered, asked questions, took pictures. A few recognized Frank and stared, surprised. He wasn't the man in a tie and polished shoes anymore. He was in a checkered apron, handing out napkins and telling stories about burnt crusts and recipes. Lily arrived halfway through with her camera, capturing the moment. She didn't say much, just smiled and snapped photos as Frank laughed with a customer, flower on his cheek. By the end of the day, as we loaded the empty trays into the trunk, Frank looked over at me, quiet for a long moment. "You know," he said, "I thought I'd lost everything when I lost that job." I looked at him. And now? Now I realize I'd only misplaced what mattered. That night, we didn't talk about the future in big, sweeping plans. We just sat on the back porch with our tea, watched the sky shift from gold to blue, and let the silence between us be soft again. Our podcast episodes slowly began to change, too. We started telling our story, the real one, from job loss to hidden pies, from shame to strength. Listeners wrote in with their own stories, and soon our inbox was filled with people asking, or what do I do when I feel invisible? Frank, once terrified of becoming irrelevant, now had purpose again. Not through authority, but through honesty. One evening, he read a message aloud from a man in Nebraska. "I haven't told my wife I was laid off 2 months ago. But after hearing you both, I'm going to. Thank you for making me feel seen." Frank looked up, tears in his eyes. "That used to be me," he whispered. And I reached for his hand. "And look at you now." He squeezed my fingers gently. "We didn't just survive," he said. "We turned it into something beautiful." Weeks turned into months. We launched a small online store. We hosted monthly baking classes at the library. Lily helped us design a printable recipe booklet titled "From Our Oven to Yours." Even Martha, our unintentional first customer, joined the team as our official taster. But more than the growth, more than the orders or the attention, what mattered most was this. Frank and I had found each other again. In the cracks, in the quiet, in the flour, dusted corners of a kitchen that had once been silent. We weren't the same people who stood at that sink months ago, afraid of what came next. We were something better. And as we closed up the kitchen that night, turning off the last light, Frank wrapped his arms around me and said, "Thanks for not giving up on me." I leaned into him and whispered, "Thanks for letting me save you." Because that's what love does. It doesn't always look like a perfect marriage or a flawless plan. Sometimes it looks like a pie cooling on a windowsill, a note tucked into a box, a second chance baked from scratch. And if you're lucky, it tastes a lot like coming home. Sometimes the storms in our lives don't arrive with thunder. They come quietly, through missed paychecks, unspoken fears, and silent dinners. But if we're lucky, we have someone who sees through the silence and chooses to stay, to bake, to rebuild, to love, even in the spaces where words fall short. Helen didn't just make pies. She made a bridge between past and future, between shame and redemption. And Frank? He didn't just find purpose again. He found the courage to be seen, to be soft, and to start over. This isn't just a story about saving a marriage. It's about how love can rise. One crust, one kind word, one brave act at a time. And in a world that often forgets the value of growing older, Helen and Frank reminded us, you're never too late. You're never too small. And you're never too old to begin again. With heart. This story reminds us that love isn't always loud or grand. It's quiet resilience, small acts of care, and choosing each other even when life gets hard. Helen's journey shows that it's never too late to rise, to adapt, and to bring light back into a home that feels dim. If this story touched you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment 2 if you liked it, or 7 if it wasn't for you. And if you want more heartfelt, true stories like this, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our channel for more every week.